The Galactic Conclave had not seen a war in 3,000 years, not a real one. There had been border disputes, of course, tense communications, the occasional posturing of warships at contested moons, but nothing that ended in blood. The species of the Conclave had evolved past that. They said it proudly at every assembly, in every diplomatic greeting, in every history chip fed to their young. We are beyond violence. We are civilized. Ambassador Sarath of the Velhari sat in the observation dome of the survey vessel Pale Current and watched the third planet of the Sol system rotate slowly beneath her. It was unremarkable at first glance, a blue-white marble, mostly ocean, continents split across its face like old scars. Her species had catalogued over 4,000 inhabited worlds in their history. Most of them looked like this. Most of them had been easy. The initial long-range scans had flagged this one as a Category 2 contact pre-interstellar civilization, some early FTL experimentation, no organized space military presence. A routine welcome mission. Sarath had handled 9 of them in her career. She expected the usual cycle, cautious first contact, weeks of linguistic algorithm work, then a gentle invitation to join the larger community of beings. The younger species were always grateful. They were always overwhelmed. They almost always cried. What she did not expect was the hail that arrived 20 minutes after the Pale Current dropped out of transit. It came in 17 different frequencies simultaneously, as if whoever sent it had decided to cover every possible band just to make sure it was received. The message, once the translation array processed it, was not a question. It was not a greeting. It was a statement, spoken in a voice that carried the particular flatness of a species that had spent centuries learning to say difficult things without flinching. Unidentified vessel, you have entered sovereign human space. Identify your origin, your purpose, and your chain of command. You have 20 minutes to respond. We are not asking twice. Sarath's communications officer looked at her. She looked at the planet. For the first time in 9 contact missions, she felt the faint, unfamiliar prickling of something she had not experienced since childhood: uncertainty. She answered them. She was polite. She was warm. She explained that the Galactic Conclave came in peace, that they had been observing Sol from a respectful distance, and that they were honored to extend an invitation of membership to the people of Earth. She used the word honored 4 times. She had learned over the years that younger species responded well to that word. The response came in 11 minutes, not 20. We know about the Conclave. We've been reading your transmissions for 60 years. We have questions. Send a delegation, not a diplomat. Send someone with actual authority. We'll meet at these coordinates. A pause so brief it might have been imagined. Come alone. We'll know if you don't. The bridge was very quiet after that. Sarath's second officer, a young Velhari named Torev, pulled up the historical data they had compiled on Earth. Sarath had skimmed it before departure. She hadn't studied it closely because Category 2 contacts rarely required it. Now she read it properly, all of it. The wars, the plagues they survived, the weapons they aimed at each other for decades and somehow never fired. The fact that every megafauna predator on their planet was now either extinct or domesticated. The life expectancy data that showed humans had doubled their natural lifespan through sheer medical stubbornness. When she finished, she set down the data chip and stared at the planet for a long time. "Torev," she said quietly. "Ambassador. Pull up our emergency contact protocols, not the diplomatic ones, the other ones," she paused, "and send a message back to Conclave Central. Tell them." She looked at the rotating blue marble, at the scarred continents, at the lights on the night side that blazed like a species that refused to sit in the dark. "Tell them we made contact. Tell them it went differently than expected. Tell them we may need some time." She didn't tell them to be afraid. Not yet. She wasn't sure she had the right words for it. She wasn't sure any words in any conclave language had ever been built to carry what she was beginning to feel. The meeting happened on a station that the humans had built specifically for the occasion. That was the first thing that unsettled Sarath, not that they had a station, but that they had built it after the hail. In 11 days. A functional pressurized structure, docking capable, with its own gravity system, and a conference room furnished in a way that suggested someone had studied Velhari ergonomics beforehand. The human delegation was 4 people. They arrived in a ship that looked like it had been repaired many times and never once prettied up. The lead negotiator was a woman named Commandant Dara Osai, a title that the translation array flagged as military, though she wore no visible rank insignia. She was shorter than Sarath had imagined from the voice, broad-shouldered, the kind of stillness in her eyes that came not from calm but from something that had trained itself to look calm. She shook Sarath's hand. The Velhari did not shake hands, it wasn't a cultural practice, but Sarath had read about it in the pre-contact files and extended her hand anyway. She regretted it immediately, not because it was painful exactly, but because the grip told her something the files had not. Osai was holding back. That was clearly a restrained grip. Sarath spent the rest of the morning wondering what an unrestrained one felt like. The talks began. They were not what Sarath expected. Younger species asked questions about the universe, about other civilizations, about what was out there. They were curious, wide-eyed, sometimes frightened by the scale of what they were entering. They needed reassurance. They needed to be told they mattered. Osai didn't ask any of those things. She asked about the Conclave's military structure. She asked who held enforcement authority over member worlds. She asked what happened when a member state was attacked and the Conclave's response was inadequate. She asked these questions in order, without hurry, and she wrote the answers down by hand in a physical notebook with a pen, which Sarath found so anachronistic it briefly broke her composure. That evening, Sarath transmitted the biology files to Conclave xenobiologist Dr. Oreth for analysis. The reply came back 6 hours later, flagged urgent. Oreth's message was 3 sentences long. These files appear corrupted. I have run verification 4 times. They are not corrupted. The data was real. Humans could operate on 18 hours without sleep for days before cognitive impairment began to seriously affect them. Their pain response was real. They felt pain as sharply as any Velhari, but their behavioral response to it was dramatically different. Where a Velhari in significant pain slowed, retreated, protected the injury, a human in significant pain often accelerated. Combat records from their own history showed soldiers continuing to fight with injuries that would have rendered any Conclave species unconscious, not because they didn't feel it, because they had decided to continue anyway. There was a word in the human files for it. Sarath looked it up. Adrenaline. A chemical their bodies produced under extreme stress that sharpened perception, dulled pain, increased strength. A biological war mode. Their own bodies had evolved to fight better when they were hurt. She thought about that for a long time. On the second day of talks, one of the junior human delegates, a young man named Specialist Yemi Adisa, apologized for being distracted. He explained that he hadn't slept in 31 hours because he'd been finishing the station's secondary power coupling the night before in case the primary failed during their visit. He smiled when he said it, like it was normal, like it was the polite, considerate thing to have done. Sarath smiled back and said it was quite all right. Then she went to her quarters, sat on the edge of her bunk, and updated her report to Conclave Central. She had initially titled it Routine Category 2 Contact Sol System. She deleted the word routine. She deleted Category 2. She stared at the blank title field for a moment, then typed, Initial Contact, Human Species, Recommend Full Council Review. She saved it. Then she added a single line at the bottom of the report below her formal observations in the section marked Personal Notes. They are not like us. I don't yet know what that means. I think we should find out carefully. The Keth had been raiding the outer edges of explored space for 200 years. Not conquering. The Conclave was careful with that word because conquest implied intent, and intent implied a level of organization that might require a formal response. The Keth raided. They took ships, stripped colonies, moved on. The conclave sent diplomatic complaints. The Keth sent back what translated roughly as laughter. 6 months after formal contact with humanity, a Keth raiding party seized 3 human colony vessels near the moon they called Emir's Shelf. The ships were carrying 4,000 civilians, mostly families, mining crews, teachers, a woman named Dr. Priya Nair who had spent 12 years developing a cold-weather crop variant specifically for the outer settlements. The Keth took them all. The conclave sent a protest, the standard language strongly worded, it always was. The humans sent nothing for 5 days. Conclave observers assumed they were processing grief, perhaps organizing relief efforts, perhaps beginning the long and painful diplomatic process the conclave had been navigating around the Keth for generations. On the 6th day, Commandant Osai requested a private channel to Conclave Central. She informed them without preamble that humanity was constructing a response fleet and that it would be departure-ready in 4 months. She asked, politely but not particularly warmly, whether the conclave wished to contribute forces or stay clear of the engagement corridor. She used the phrase engagement corridor as if it were a standard term, as if it were something she said regularly, as if all of this were already settled. The Conclave Council spent 3 days in emergency session. Several members argued for caution. Several argued that humanity was not yet a full member and had no mandate to act. One elder representative, a Velhari statesman named Councillor Orath, argued that they should simply let events unfold and observe. He had read the biology files by then. He wanted to see what happened when something like that was pushed. The fleet was ready in 3 months and 20 days, not 4. 20 days early, because the shipyard crews had started working double shifts on their own initiative, without being asked, without additional pay offered, because the 4,000 civilians were still missing and the crews had children of their own. Osai's broadcast to the Keth was brief. Conclave translators confirmed the message was accurate. There was no diplomatic padding, no formal structure, no procedural language. It was 9 sentences. The final one read, "Return all 4,912 individuals unharmed at these coordinates within 72 hours, or the next thing I send to your home system will not be a message." The Keth had never retreated from a threat. In 200 years of raiding, no species in the conclave had made them retreat. Some conclave analysts believed retreat was not in their behavioral framework, that they were, biologically, incapable of processing a threat as credible without first testing it. The Keth released the hostages in 61 hours. Dr. Priya Nair was among them. She was slightly malnourished and deeply angry. She spent the first 2 hours of her debriefing answering questions. She spent the rest of it asking them, specifically, how the conclave had allowed the Keth to operate this way for 2 centuries, and what exactly they planned to do about the other species who had been taken before humanity arrived to cause a fuss. That question reverberated through conclave halls for weeks, not because it was aggressive, because it was the first time in living memory that a newly contacted species had looked at a 200-year-old problem and asked, not diplomatically, not carefully, but with the blunt curiosity of someone who genuinely couldn't understand the delay, why it hadn't been solved yet. Councillor Orath added a note to his personal file on humanity that evening. It was short. It read, "They do not see waiting as wisdom. They see it as failure. I'm no longer certain they are wrong." Conflict on Dora IV had been ongoing for 11 years by the time the Joint Conclave peacekeeping deployment arrived. It was a civil war, technically, 2 factions of the same species fighting over a mineral basin large enough to power a continent. 11 years. Conclave peacekeepers had cycled in and out 3 times. The war kept restarting after each ceasefire the moment the peacekeepers rotated home. This deployment included, for the first time, a human unit. 30 soldiers under Staff Sergeant Yemi Adisa, the same young man who had fixed the station's power coupling on no sleep during the first contact talks. He was 26 years old. He had been in 4 separate conflict zones before Dora IV. He looked to the Velhari peacekeeping officers, entirely too relaxed about that fact. The operation began as a standard security corridor establishment. Move into contested territory, hold ground, protect civilian evacuation routes. The Velhari doctrine on this was precise. Advance until you reach 20% unit casualties, then consolidate and call for relief. 20% was the threshold. Hold below 20% and you were effective. Exceed it and you were a liability. On the third day, a faction force hit the eastern flank of the corridor with concentrated fire. Within 40 minutes, the Velhari unit had reached 18% casualties. Their commander, Lieutenant Isabel, gave the order to pull back to the secondary line. The human unit did not pull back. Isabel watched from the secondary position as Sergeant Addis's 30 soldiers held the eastern corridor alone. She watched through her tactical display, not through direct observation. Direct observation wasn't tactically sound when pulling back, but the feed told her enough. Addisa was hit in the left shoulder in the first 10 minutes of the solo hold. She could see his biometric feed spike, pain registered, adrenaline response confirmed, and then she watched him continue directing his unit. Not despite the wound. With it, as if the wound had simply become another variable in a problem he was solving in real time. 2 of his soldiers were down. He dragged one out of the open with his injured arm. He did it during active fire. He did it while simultaneously talking on comms. She could hear him, calm and specific, calling out positions to the soldiers still standing, adjusting their formation, keeping them from compressing into a target. The faction force broke contact after 93 minutes, not because they were beaten, they had superior numbers, because something had changed in the way the human unit was fighting. The faction had experience against conclave peacekeepers. They knew the doctrine. They knew how to push until the threshold was hit. What they didn't know, what no one on Dora IV knew, was that the humans didn't have a threshold, not one they'd recognize. When Isabel reached the eastern line, Addisa was sitting on a piece of broken wall getting his shoulder dressed by a medic. He had his notebook out, the same kind of physical paper notebook that Osa had used in the first contact talks, Isabel noted, and was writing down what he called corrective observations. Things his unit could have done better. He looked up when she approached, nodded, and said, "Good news is, the corridor held. Bad news is we've got a structural gap at the northeast corner. I'd like to address it before tonight if that's all right with you, sir." Isabel filed her report that night. In the section on joint unit performance, she wrote the most honest sentence she had written in her career. Human soldiers do not appear to use the same cost-benefit framework for continuation under fire that all other conclave species employ. They appear to use a different question entirely. Not, can we afford to continue? But, is there still something worth continuing for? As long as the answer to the second question is yes, the first question seems not to apply. She submitted it, then sat at her desk for a long time, staring at nothing, trying to remember if she had ever, in 15 years of peacekeeping, seen something she couldn't model. She decided she had not. Until today, the Conclave archives held records on 11,000 civilizations. The archivists who worked there were careful, meticulous beings. The Lohari, a species so devoted to preservation that they had once spent 400 years transcribing the oral histories of a species that had gone extinct before developing writing. They were patient. They were thorough. They had never, in institutional memory, been frightened by something they found in the files. Senior archivist Telos was the one who formally opened the Earth Historical Record Project. It was supposed to be a standard intake, part of the membership process, a cataloging of pre-contact history for the official conclave record. He assigned it to a junior team and expected 6 months of routine work. The junior team requested an emergency meeting with him after 3 weeks. They sat in his office, 4 of them, all Lohari, all of whom had dedicated their careers to the quiet, unhurried work of historical preservation, and they looked like they hadn't slept properly. Telos asked them what was wrong. The team lead, A young archivist named Vesha placed a data chip on his desk and said, very quietly, "We think there may be something wrong with the source files. We need a second opinion." There was nothing wrong with the source files. Tellus spent 2 weeks verifying it himself. What the files contained was this: 6,000 years of organized, systematic, large-scale warfare. Not raiding, not the sporadic territorial conflict that many species engaged in at early stages of development. Organized war, with strategy, with logistics, with the deliberate development of technology specifically designed to kill members of their own species more efficiently. They had done this continuously, across every continent, across every century of their recorded history, right up until the moment they reached for the stars. They had survived a plague that killed 1 in 3 of them in 4 years. They had not collapsed. They had not retreated into fragmented survival groups. They had grieved and burned their dead and within a generation rebuilt everything that had been lost and expanded beyond it. One species, one planet, one catastrophe after another, and they kept standing up. The nuclear period was what finally made Telos set down the files and simply stare at his wall for a while. For 53 years, the dominant human nations had pointed weapons at each other that were capable of ending their civilization entirely. Both sides had known this. Both sides had said this publicly, repeatedly, to their own populations. They had called it deterrence, a doctrine of deliberately holding your own species hostage in order to prevent the other side from acting. It was the most terrifying strategic framework Telos had ever encountered, and it had worked. Not because either side was rational in a way the conclave would recognize, but because both sides were stubborn enough to stare into oblivion for 5 decades and never blink first. Telos wrote his summary report carefully. He was a good archivist. He used precise language. He did not editorialize. But at the end of the summary, in the section marked preliminary analysis, he permitted himself one observation. Most species, when catalogued at this stage of development, show signs of violence in their past and cooperation in their trajectory. The human record is the reverse. Their cooperation, their remarkable, sophisticated, genuine cooperation, appears to have been built on top of, not instead of, the violence. They did not grow past it. They incorporated it. Their capacity for war and their capacity for civilization are not in tension. They are the same thing, expressed differently depending on whether they feel threatened. He submitted the report. Then he requested a personal meeting with Sarath, who had by now returned from Sol system and was widely considered the conclave's leading human specialist. He had one question for her, and it was not historical. It was operational. "Ambassador," he said, "what precisely would a species like this feel threatened by?" Sarath looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Anything that touches what they love." Telos walked home slowly that night. The city around him was peaceful. It had been peaceful his whole life. He had never thought to be grateful for that before. He was grateful for it now. Dr. Inara was not a military analyst. She was a psychologist, one of the Velhari's foremost authorities on cross-species behavioral modeling, and she had been asked to answer a single question that the conclave had been quietly circling for 2 years without daring to ask directly. Why haven't they conquered anyone? It was, she knew, the question that kept several council members awake. The Keth had military capability and used it for dominance. The old Doranic Empire had used technology as a lever of control. Every aggressive species in conclave history had followed the same basic pattern: power accumulates, power expands. Humanity had, by every measure the conclave possessed, more raw martial capacity than any species they had encountered in the past 1,000 years. And they had done nothing with it except come to the table and shake hands. The interviews with diplomat Kofi Mensah ran for 40 hours across 8 sessions. Mensah was a deliberate choice, a human who had spent 30 years in interspecies negotiation, who was fluent in 4 conclave languages, who was, by human standards, considered exceptionally measured and patient. Inara wanted to understand humanity through its most careful representative. She asked him in their third session why humanity had not used its military advantage to establish dominance over newly contacted species. She asked it carefully, academically, framing it as a modeling question. Mensa was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's a strange question to us. Conquest is expensive. You have to administer what you take. You have to suppress resistance indefinitely. You have to become something you won't like very much." He paused. "We tried it. For a long time on our own planet we tried it. It always ends the same way. The conqueror rots from the inside." Inara asked, "Then what do you want?" Mensa thought about that longer than any previous question. "We want our people to be safe," he said finally. "We want our children to grow up in a galaxy that isn't hunting them. We want to know that if something comes for what we've built, what we've loved, there's something between it and us that can hold." He looked at her directly. "We spent 10,000 years being the most dangerous thing on our planet. Then we looked up and found out the galaxy was full of things we didn't know about. That's not a comfortable feeling. We deal with discomfort by preparing." Inara spent 3 days analyzing the interview transcripts. What she found was consistent across all 40 hours. Humans did not fight for dominance. They fought for preservation. The distinction sounded minor. It was not. A species that fought for dominance could be satisfied, give them enough, and they would stop pushing. A species that fought for preservation had no ceiling. Their threat perception determined their response, and their threat perception was calibrated to a planet that had been trying to kill them since before they could speak. She presented her findings to the full council in a closed session. She concluded with an observation she had gone back and forth on including. It felt too stark, too blunt for a formal academic presentation. In the end, she included it because it was true. "A conqueror," she said, "can be reasoned with, appeased, redirected. A conqueror wants something specific, and specific wants can be addressed. What humanity has described to me is not a want. It is a state. They want to feel that what they love is safe. That state can never be fully achieved. The galaxy will always contain something that might threaten what they love, which means by their own internal logic they will never be done preparing." She paused. "They are not a threat to the conclave. I want to be absolutely clear about that. They have shown no aggression, no territorial ambition, nothing we would classify as predatory expansion. But I would suggest that the appropriate response to what they are is not vigilance. It is gratitude, because something is coming for the conclave eventually. Something always is. And when it comes, I would very much like humanity to be on our side of the line." The chamber was quiet for a long moment after she finished. Then Counselor Orath, who had been listening with his hands folded and his eyes half closed, said, "I have one question. What do we have to do to make sure they stay there?" Nobody had a quick answer. That was perhaps the most frightening thing of all. No one in the conclave had a good name for them. The word the records used, Vreth, was not their name for themselves. It was the word the Duranic Empire had transmitted in their last broadcast, 1400 years ago, before going silent. Scholars had debated whether it was a name, a warning, or simply a sound someone had made in the final moments before the signal died. The debate was largely academic. The Duranic Empire was gone. So was every other civilization that had engaged the Vreth and not retreated. They came from beyond the galactic rim. They moved in formations that had no military analog in conclave doctrine, not because they were more sophisticated, but because they were built on a different logic entirely. Conclave military theory was about attrition, position, supply lines, calculated withdrawal. The Vreth did not withdraw. They did not calculate. They advanced until the opposition was gone or they were. The conclave had determined, over 1400 years and across the ruins of 6 extinct civilizations, that it was always the opposition that ended first. When the Vreth touched human space, they did it the way they always did, without announcement, without demand, without any communication at all. A frontier world called New Cascadia had a population of 300,000. It had a small defense garrison, a mining infrastructure, and a school that had just graduated its first class of local-born doctors. The Vreth hit it in the early morning of a Tuesday local time. The conclave prepared condolences. This was not cynicism, it was pattern recognition. When the Vreth struck, you evacuated what you could and mourned what you couldn't. That was the lesson of 1400 years. Counselor Oreth drafted a formal expression of grief to the human delegation. He kept it restrained because humans disliked excessive formality, but he made sure it conveyed genuine sorrow. He had grandchildren. He understood what 300,000 people meant. Then the human response came in, and the conclave stopped drafting condolences. Commandant Osai did not appear on the channel. The message was audio only, and it was not addressed to the conclave. It was addressed to every human military unit, every human ship, every human installation in the outer systems. Conclave Signals Intelligence picked it up by accident. It was 3 sentences. New Cascadia is under attack. All available units converge on these coordinates. Nobody gets left behind. What followed was something conclave analysts struggled to describe in their post-action reports because they had no prior reference for it. Human ships, not a formal fleet, not an organized response force, but ships from mining operations, from escort routes, from patrol assignments, from a half-dozen different service branches that had apparently all received the same message and made the same decision independently, began converging on New Cascadia within hours. The coordination was not perfect. The equipment was not uniform. By conclave military standards, it was barely a coherent force. It hit the Vreth like a wall. Not because the humans were winning. They weren't, not clearly, not at first. But because they were doing something the Vreth had never encountered in 1400 years of expansion. They were not leaving. Every species the Vreth had engaged had eventually reached a point where retreat became the rational option. That point had arrived and passed for the humans at New Cascadia, and they hadn't taken it. They hadn't even slowed. Lieutenant Commander Addisa, promoted twice in 4 years, which was apparently not unusual for humans in active conflict, was among the first wave. His ship took damage in the opening exchange that would have, by any standard model, warranted withdrawal. He didn't withdraw. He pushed into the formation gap the damage had accidentally created and hit the Vreth's secondary array from a direction their tactical model didn't account for, because their tactical model had never needed to account for a ship that stayed in a fight after sustaining that kind of damage. 47 hours after first contact, the Vreth did something that had no entry in the Conclave's 1400-year record of their behavior. They disengaged. Not a retreat under pursuit, a deliberate pulling back, a formation shift, a withdrawal to distance. Analysts argued for weeks about whether it constituted a retreat in any meaningful sense, but New Cascadia was intact. The school was intact. The doctors were intact. 284,000 of 300,000 civilians had been successfully sheltered or evacuated during the fight. Osai's post-engagement report to the conclave was brief. She listed casualties. She listed resource expenditure. She listed recommended repairs. In the section marked engagement assessment, she wrote 4 words. They blinked, we didn't. The emergency session of the full Galactic Conclave Council convened 14 days after the Vreth withdrew from New Cascadia. Every member species sent a representative. Several sent heads of state. It was the largest gathering the conclave had held in 3 centuries, and the agenda had exactly 1 item. What do we do about humanity? The debate ran for 2 days. Sarath sat in the observer gallery and listened to it all. She had been asked to present a statement but not to vote. Her role was advisory. She watched the council work through positions she had anticipated and some she hadn't. 3 factions had emerged in the months since the Keth incident, and New Cascadia had sharpened all of them. The first faction wanted formal classification of humanity as a security concern. Not an enemy, They were careful to avoid that word, but a power requiring structured oversight. Their argument was logical. Any species that could hold the Vreth at New Cascadia was a species that, if its interests ever diverged from the conclave's, could threaten anyone in it. Best to establish clear parameters now, while the relationship was still young and malleable. The second faction wanted expedited full membership with maximum military integration. Bring the humans in completely. Align their interests with conclave interests so thoroughly that divergence became impossible. The Vreth had retreated once. They would return, better prepared. Every year without a formal alliance was a year wasted. The third faction was the smallest. It was led unexpectedly by a Keth representative, a species that had reason to fear humanity more than most, and had come to the session saying something remarkable. "We were wrong about them," the Keth representative said. She was older, moved slowly, and spoke with the directness of someone who had survived long enough to stop being careful with words. "We thought they were raiders like us. They are not. We raided for dominance. They fought for children they had never met, on a world most of them couldn't find on a map 2 months ago. I have been fighting wars for 60 years. I know the difference." By the second day, the debate had narrowed to the first two factions. The security concern argument was eloquent, thorough, and made logical sense. It also, Sarath noticed, made the humans sound like a problem to be managed rather than a species to be known, and she had spent enough time among humans to understand that they would see that distinction clearly and respond to it accordingly. Managing them would not go well for anyone. When it was her turn to speak, she stood at the observer podium and looked at a room full of the most powerful representatives in the known galaxy, and she said what she had been building toward for 2 years. Since a hail on 17 frequencies, since a crushing handshake, since a young soldier dragged a wounded comrade through open fire because it hadn't occurred to him to leave someone behind. "We spent 3,000 years building a civilization that flinched," she said. "Not because we are cowards, we are not, but because we are wise, and wisdom told us that the cost of conflict outweighed the value of victory. We built a galaxy of careful, measured, non-violent beings who negotiate and retreat and preserve themselves, and it works beautifully until something comes that doesn't negotiate, doesn't retreat, and doesn't care about preservation." She paused. "The Vreth came 6 times before New Cascadia. Each time we lost someone. Each time we mourned and moved on because the alternative was a war we couldn't win. We couldn't win it because winning requires something we selected out of ourselves a long time ago. Earth never selected it out. Earth couldn't afford to." She looked around the chamber. "They are not heroes. I want to be precise about that. They are not noble in the way our stories tell us noble looks. They are stubborn and loud, and they keep notebooks they write in by hand, and they fix things at 3 in the morning that don't technically need to be fixed yet, just in case. They dragged themselves out of a world that was trying to kill them for 4 billion years, and they showed up here. And when something came for a colony they barely knew, they flew toward it instead of away from it." Her voice did not waver. "We were not ready for them. We had no framework for them. And that is the greatest gift we have ever received, because the galaxy was not ready for the Vreth either, and the Vreth found that out at New Cascadia, and next time they will bring more, and the time after that, and every single time. I want these people standing between the conclave and whatever is coming." The vote for conclave protector status passed. It was not unanimous the first round. It was unanimous the second, after the Keth representative changed her delegation's vote and, without explanation, stood up and nodded once at the observer gallery before sitting back down. Sarath returned to her quarters and sat at her desk and wrote a message to Commandant Osai. It was not an official communication. It was a personal one. She told her about the vote. She told her that it had been difficult. She told her, with the particular honesty that comes from 2 years of careful observation, that the conclave was still a little afraid of humanity, and that she thought humanity probably knew that, and that she hoped it wouldn't matter in the end. Osai's reply came 4 hours later, audio only. She heard the ambient sound of a ship, something running in the background, someone else's voice asking a question and being answered in the kind of shorthand that meant the work was ongoing and the day was long. Then Osai's voice, quiet and direct as always, "Tell them we know, tell them it's okay. The things that are coming don't care whether anyone's afraid, they only care whether anyone shows up." A pause. "We'll show up." Sarath saved the message. She played it 3 more times. Then she looked out at the star field beyond her window, the same stars she had been watching her whole career, the same quiet, ancient, indifferent dark, and felt, for the first time she could name, something that was almost peace. Not because the danger was gone, because for the first time she understood exactly what was standing in front of it.